Welcome to Sectionalism Part 2, Prelude to the American Civil War. This one should go faster than the last. What this really concerns with is essentially the 1850s and how these different events began to polarize America between the North and the South, how both sides would interpret these events differently, and how it ultimately leads into, accelerates this breakup that we have with the American Civil War. And so one of the first events that really frames a lot of these issues is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, okay, where they open up Kansas and Nebraska, okay, to popular sovereignty. And so Kansas would get to vote whether or not they would be slave or free. So again, another quick look, okay, at the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so during this time period, you also have the birth of the Republican Party. The Republican Party forms in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Whig Party will collapse. The Republican Party forms, and so as a result, okay, you're going to get this new party, and again, they will eventually get the symbol of the elephant. I will drop a link to you exploring the reason that they get the elephant. The Democratic donkey we went into with Andrew Jackson, and frankly, it's a better story. Okay, but the Republicans will get the elephant, and so check that out if you're curious about where that came from. It's not as good a story overall. And so popular sovereignty in Kansas. Now that slave or free status for Kansas would be determined by popular sovereignty, proponents of both sides would seek to affect the vote. We have people moving from the north, as far away as Massachusetts, to Kansas itself, to alter the vote to make sure that Kansas is free. Meanwhile, you have people crossing the border from Missouri to make sure that Kansas will be slave. In the eventual election, there would be 6,300 votes cast in it. Small problem. You actually only have 3,000 eligible voters in Kansas at the time. And so what follows is that Kansas becomes the source of violence as people get passionate about this issue. And so May 21st, 1856, the guy that you're looking at right here on the right is the famous John Brown. And so John Brown would have what I would call the worst father-son bonding experience in American history. John Brown and his sons would basically grab these guys out of their homes in the dead of the night and basically kill them with broadswords. And again, I'm giving you the light version here. A broadsword is a big sword. Okay, we are talking like Braveheart-looking medieval sword. And so basically they'll kill 5 pro-slavery settlers, and Kansas will become known as Bleeding Kansas. And the John Brown violence is not the end of the violence in Kansas. And this is not really where John Brown gets famous. And so we have some famous images of John Brown. Again, usually you see him with a beard. Okay, and it leads to an event in American history that we call Bleeding Kansas. Fighting begins to happen throughout the state. Little paramilitary units fighting it out. You have people fighting it out in the streets. And hundreds of people are killed. We dispute to this day how many there were. And it's viewed as a precursor or foreshadowing to the eventual Civil War a good 7 years later. And so Kansas would enter the Union ultimately as a free state. And to this day, when Kansas, the college, the university, plays Missouri, the university, it is a big rivalry that goes back to this history. It used to be that both were Big 12 teams. Missouri left and went to the SEC. But this was called the Border War. It's a big college football, college basketball rivalry. And so here you'll see, again, some of the violence taking place in Kansas. And it leads to other events, such as 1856, the caning of Senator Charles Sumner. Northern Senator Charles Sumner gives a speech in which he criticizes slaveholders for their behavior. And you have people who take offense. And so Congressman Preston Brooks will take his cane and beat Charles Sumner viciously on the floor of the Senate. Another one of his friends would actually be standing by with a gun to hold people off in the Senate, saying, don't intervene, like don't think about it. And so this violence, it causes the people in the North to look at the Southerners. They are beating our senators on the floor of the Senate. Look at how crazy they're becoming. And in the South, it's interpreted differently. They see Sumner as the aggressor. And so then you have Uncle Tom's Cabin. 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin. Many people in the North had never been exposed to slavery. They have no TV, they have no internet. So the only way that they can become sensitized to it is to read dramatic accounts, and Uncle Tom's Cabin provides it. And so people read this thing for the first time and they realize how absolutely brutal and dehumanizing slavery is. And it causes a swelling of abolitionists in the North, where people go, look, slavery is wrong. When Abraham Lincoln meets Harriet Beecher Stowe later, he will say to her, so you're the little woman that started this great war. I don't think I would use that phrase with somebody. I think Harriet Beecher Stowe probably didn't like being accused of, starting something that caused so many deaths. Okay, but Uncle Tom's Cabin becomes a huge factor in informing the American public about the nature of slavery. Dred Scott versus Sanford is also a huge case in American history. What will happen is in 1857, a slave from Missouri named Dred Scott will sue for his freedom. He had been taken to the North where slavery was not allowed. Scott's case gets to the Supreme Court, and ultimately, pop back to that, the Supreme Court decision, is that Roger Taney, the lead justice on the Supreme Court, Taney had at one point owned slaves. He had freed them. But Taney is from the South. He's from Maryland. Taney does not want to start a civil war. He's afraid of that. So part of Taney's decision was what he thought. He was trying to avoid a civil war. And he delivers one of the most infamous court decisions in American history. His decision says that Dred Scott cannot legally sue because he's not a citizen. It goes further. It says the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional because the Missouri Compromise can't ban slavery anywhere. And it said basically that people who were African Americans, people who were black, that none of them have true citizenship. So therefore, all of this is unacceptable. It underscores the fact that the decision will treat slaves as property and not as people. And so, basically, the Dred Scott decision by Taney is basically, most people on the court were actually from southern slave states. And so about 5-4 in that. The decision ends up being about 7-2. And we look back at this as one of the more disastrous decisions in American history. And so this becomes hugely outrageous in the North. In the South, they think it's great. Dred Scott will eventually have his freedom purchased, and he will live out his final 3 years in freedom. This is his grave. And so I'll drop a link where you can explore some of Dred Scott's final years. Okay, the final thing that happens, is John Brown's raid. Okay, this is one of the next incidents. And so in October 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown, who we had talked about in Kansas, will do what ultimately becomes his big act. Okay, he hopes to seize a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and give out the weapons to slaves. He wants to create the slave uprising to end all slave uprisings. And he seeks out Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. And he says, hey, look, I'm kind of a white guy here, and I don't think that I can get enough support, among all the slaves and all the people. I need you guys to help me out. And so Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass actually back away from some of their support for John Brown in this process. Tubman debated whether or not she should go. And so, as a result, when they seized the town of Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which you can see here, this railroad that's running through the town, there is a train that sees them capturing people, and that train goes on to Baltimore. And when it gets to Baltimore, it reports back that John Brown was taking Harper's Ferry. The federal government responds by sending in troops and capturing John Brown. And John Brown will eventually be executed. And so here's a few John Brown quotes about slavery and what he thought. And I want you guys to explore some of his quotes and tell me which one that you might like the best, or maybe which one you find to be most controversial. John Brown had a view of slavery that slavery was evil, but what's more controversial about John Brown's view, it's not that slavery is evil, it's controversial. What's controversial is that John Brown thinks that you can shed blood in order to make it right. And so John Brown is a serious Bible-believing Christian at the time, but that is his interpretation of Scripture. So here's another John Brown quote. Okay, and another. Okay, and so ultimately John Brown will be executed. And again, it's interpreted differently in the North and the South. The North thinks it's a travesty. The South thinks this is how crazy the North is getting, that they're trying to give guns to slaves. What follows is the election of 1860. Now, we can get into detail on this election, but let's just say that Lincoln and Douglas are kind of the two biggest individuals in determining who the North will vote for. Their Lincoln-Douglas debates are arguably the most famous debates in American history, and to this day, if you ever join a debate team, they will end up doing Lincoln-Douglas style debates. Lincoln does not want slavery eliminated everywhere as his platform. Some people think that he does. In fact, Lincoln says that slavery should not be extended to new territories. Lincoln says, look, I will leave it alone where it is. I won't touch it. Said, but I'm also not letting it expand. And so this is extremely threatening, to the South, because they realize that if free states keep expanding, according to Lincoln, that's what would happen, and slave states don't get to, that ultimately free states will always get what they want in the national government. And so when Lincoln runs, southern states will threaten secession. And spoiler alert, Lincoln will win.
Hi, my name is Matthew.
And so where we get here, quick political cartoon of the four candidates. Lincoln will basically win every northern state. He will not win a single southern state. Breckinridge will win virtually all the South, and Bell will get some of the border states that we'll talk about later. But Lincoln's victory sets in motion the final domino, the final thing to fall. When Lincoln is elected, the South says this is it. And so just as they had threatened 30 years prior, due to the Tariff of Abominations with John C. Calhoun in South Carolina, here we are now 30 years later, and the first state to secede, to leave, will be South Carolina. When this happens, Lincoln, who has to be snuck into D.C., he's already under assassination threat. Lincoln will have to make the decision to reinforce a fort that sits in the center of Charleston Harbor. And so when he makes the decision to reinforce that federal national fort in the middle of Charleston Harbor, basically the fort will come under attack. And this is what we mark as the beginning of the American Civil War. And so here you can see This is the secession of the southern states.